Since the beginning of a full-scale war, Russia has increased funding for propaganda at least 3 times, and the Kremlin propagandists worked out subsidies that amounted in billions with all their might. With a particular zeal, they tried to convince both the Russians and the whole world that sanctions against the Kremlin did not work. So according to the logic of propagandists, there is no need to continue them, but the reality turned out to be different. Slowly but surely, anti-Russian sanctions undermined the Russian economy.
At the end of the third quarter of 2022, almost 5 million Russian workers were exposed to various forms of hidden unemployment. Notably, 70% of them were on unpaid leave. In fact, 10% of the Russian labor force is unemployed. This is comparable to the worst figures of the 1990s, in the second half of which from 10 to 13% of Russians were unemployed. Vladimir Milov, former Deputy Minister of Energy of Russia.
However, rising unemployment is already a consequence of the economic downturn. The exodus of foreign companies from the market, the closure of production, the shutdown of factories, the freezing of construction projects have significantly slowed down the Russian economy. The main blow fell on the oil and gas industry. The civilized world began to refuse Russian energy resources, and the Kremlin had to close the fields.
In an article for Foreign Affairs, just imagine, instead of a prosperous industry, money deposits had to be simply filled with water, simply destroyed. Unemployment increased in the villages where gas was produced, and in some villages they lived only at the expense of this gas. The same situation happened with oil. People began to starve in some small cities because they lost their jobs. Their jobs are not profitable, there is nowhere to sell this oil, and it will get even worse.
Experts believe that by the end of the year, the fall in Russia's GDP will reach 8%, and this could turn out to be a disaster for the Putin's regime. Therefore, the Kremlin is trying to hide the real picture by manipulating the indicators.
Politicians critical of the sanctions point to the Russian finance ministry's forecast that the country's GDP will shrink by 2.7%, which appears to belie the notion that the economy is collapsing. Note, however, that this GDP figure includes the growth in military production. A newly produced battle tank, immediately sent to the front line and destroyed by a Ukrainian Javelin missile, is still considered a nominal contribution to Russia's GDP. Vladimir Milov, former Deputy Minister of Energy of Russia.
Putin managed to hide the truth and maintain the appearance of stability in the country thanks to the National Wealth Fund. For years, the Kremlin funneled excess profits from the sale of gas and oil into this reserve fund. Then he also financed the continuation of the war in Ukraine from this fund. According to experts, the fund has about $40 billion left, and you cannot really count on foreign reserves because out of more than $640 billion, the Kremlin has access to only $260 billion. The rest is under Western sanctions.
In an article for Foreign Affairs, this means that the Russian economy does not have necessary financial cushion in order to promptly respond in case of any situations and shocks in the foreign exchange market. As a result of the fact that there was an outflow of capital according to the estimates of the central bank, $251 billion was withdrawn from Russia in 2022. Today, they do not have the necessary assets in order to respond to the situation on the market. Therefore, they act with prohibitions, like you cannot take capital abroad, that is, the same percentages, take money out, and so on.
Experts believe that the Russian economy will face an even greater decline by the spring. After all, Ukraine and its partners are working on new sanctions against Russia, and it is quite likely that Russia will face another price cut for oil to 35% per barrel, what will finally finish off the budget of the Kremlin. Reported by Dana Kolesnik, Ksenia Barvinenko, UATV News.